Hello there, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, wherever you are. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet room where the evening has settled in? A peaceful corner where you can finally rest? Tonight we're going to explore one of history's most enduring mysteries, the Lost Colony of Roanoke. In 1587, 117 English men, women, and children arrived on a small island off the coast of what would become North Carolina. 3 years later, they had vanished completely, leaving behind only a single word carved into a wooden post. We'll discover who these colonists were, understand the world they left behind and the world they hoped to build, and contemplate what their disappearance might mean, both then and now. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a frightening ghost story or a tale of horror. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the historical record, the archaeology, the theories that scholars have developed over 4 centuries, taking our time with each discovery. By the end, I think you'll find that the mystery of Roanoke is less about terror and more about the profound questions of memory, survival, and what it means to vanish from history. If you enjoy these calm explorations of historical mysteries, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, for returning to these quiet journeys through time. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath, and let it out even slower, and let's begin our slow drift through the story of Roanoke. There's nowhere you need to be right now. Nothing you need to do. Just listen and let the story unfold. Let the mystery reveal itself gently, layer by layer, like pages turning in a very old book. To understand why 117 people would board ships and sail into the unknown, we need to understand England in the 1580s. This was an England emerging from decades of religious turmoil, an England looking outward with a mixture of ambition and desperation. Queen Elizabeth I sat on the throne, and her England was a nation trying to find its place in a world increasingly shaped by Spanish and Portuguese power. Spain had discovered vast wealth in Central and South America. Silver flowed from the mines of Potosi, transforming Spain into the wealthiest nation in Europe. England watched this transformation with a complicated mixture of envy and determination. But England's interest in the New World wasn't purely about wealth, though wealth certainly mattered. There was also a genuine curiosity about what lay across the Atlantic. Maps of the time showed coastlines fading into speculation and imagination. Cartographers drew what they knew, and then, where knowledge ended, they drew what they hoped or feared might be true. Sea monsters filled the empty spaces. Mysterious lands beckoned at the edges. The idea of America, though that name was barely beginning to be used, captured the English imagination in ways that went beyond mere profit. Writers and adventurers spoke of a new world where English civilization might be planted, where a pure version of English society might flourish, free from the complications and corruptions of the old. This wasn't just idle dreaming. The Spanish model had shown that colonization could work, though the English were careful to tell themselves their approach would be different. Where Spain conquered, they would befriend. Where Spain enslaved, they would trade fairly. These were the stories they told themselves as they planned their ventures. And there was another element too. One we might find harder to understand from our modern perspective. Many English Protestants saw colonization as a kind of religious calling. They believed they were bringing Christianity, their version of Christianity, to people who had never heard it. This missionary impulse mixed with commercial ambition in ways that seemed perfectly natural to them, even essential. The idea had been growing for decades, as early as 1576. The mathematician and navigator John Dee had been writing about an English empire that might span the Atlantic. Sir Humphrey Gilbert had received a patent from Queen Elizabeth in 1578 to establish colonies. Though Gilbert's own ventures ended in failure and his death at sea, the idea persisted. By the 1580s, England was ready to try again. The nation had the ships, the navigators, the capital, and most importantly, the will. What they needed was the right leader, the right vision, and the right moment. These elements were about to come together in the person of one man, Sir Walter Raleigh. And this brings us to the question of why Roanoke specifically. There were thousands of miles of coastline, countless potential locations. Why did the English choose this particular island, this particular place? The answer lies in a combination of strategic thinking, limited knowledge, and the recommendations of men who had sailed those waters before. To understand the choice, we need to understand the man who made it, and the expeditions that came before the colony itself. Walter Raleigh was 30 years old when he began planning his American venture. He was already a favourite of Queen Elizabeth, known for his quick wit, his poetry, and his military service in Ireland. The Queen had granted him estates and monopolies, making him wealthy. But Raleigh wanted something more than wealth. He wanted legacy. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth granted Raleigh a charter to explore and colonize lands in North America. The charter was generous in its scope, giving Raleigh rights to all the land he could claim, provided he established a colony within 6 years. It was both an extraordinary opportunity and an enormous pressure. Raleigh was a dreamer, but he was also a practical man. He knew he couldn't simply send people into the wilderness and hope for the best. He needed information. He needed to know what the land was like, what resources existed, what peoples lived there, and whether they might be friendly or hostile to English settlement. So Raleigh organised what we might call a reconnaissance mission. In 1584, he sent 2 ships under the command of Philip Amadus and Arthur Barlow to explore the coast and bring back information. They were to observe, to trade, to learn, but not to settle. Not yet. The expedition that Amadus and Barlow led was, by their own accounts, remarkably successful. They made landfall on the outer banks of present-day North Carolina and encountered the Roanoke and Croatoan peoples. The reports they brought back to England painted a picture of a land rich in resources and inhabited by people who seemed welcoming. Barlow's written account of the voyage reads almost like a promotional pamphlet, which in some ways it was. He described the land as most plentiful, sweet, fruitful, and wholesome of all the world. He wrote of grapes growing down to the water's edge, of forests filled with cedar and cypress, of deer and rabbits and birds in abundance. More importantly, perhaps, Barlow described peaceful interactions with the native peoples. He told of a chief named Wingina who welcomed them, of Wingina's brother Granganimeo who traded with them, and of Granganimeo's wife who showed them extraordinary hospitality. These accounts suggested that an English colony might not only survive but thrive, trading peacefully with the local population. Amadas and Barlow brought 2 native men back with them to England, Manteo and Wanchesi. This was common practice at the time, though we should be honest about what it meant. These men didn't volunteer for a cultural exchange program. They were taken, though the English preferred to phrase it as them coming willingly. In England, they were displayed, taught English, and questioned extensively about their homeland. Manteo and Wanchesi's presence in London served Raleigh's purposes perfectly. They were living proof that the venture was real, that there were indeed people and lands across the ocean. Raleigh used them to generate excitement and investment for his colonial project. Based on the glowing reports from this first expedition, Raleigh began planning something more ambitious. He would send a military expedition that would establish a base, explore more extensively, and prepare the way for actual settlement. This second expedition, launched in 1585, would be larger and more formal. Raleigh named the land Virginia, in honour of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. It was a name that would stick, though it initially referred to a much broader area than the modern state of Virginia. This was Raleigh's land now, at least in English eyes, and he intended to make the most of it. But Raleigh himself never set foot in Virginia. This fact is worth pausing on. The man who dreamed the dream, who organised the expeditions, who convinced investors and recruited colonists, never saw the land he claimed. He remained in England, close to the Queen. managing his interests from afar. He sent others to do the actual work of exploring and settling. This decision, to stay in England rather than lead his colony in person, would have profound implications for what came next. The colony would be governed by men Raleigh appointed, men who shared his vision but perhaps not his skill at managing the complex politics such a venture required. Let's turn our attention now to that second expedition, the one that would teach the English hard lessons about survival in a strange land. In April of 1585, a fleet of 7 ships left Plymouth carrying over 600 men. This was no small venture. Sir Richard Grenville commanded the fleet, with Ralph Lane designated as governor of whatever colony they established. Grenville was a military man, known for his courage but also for his quick temper and harsh methods. Lane was similarly experienced in military matters, having served in Ireland. The expedition also included Thomas Harriot, a mathematician and scientist whose role was to observe and document everything about the new land. Harriot was brilliant, trained at Oxford, and genuinely curious about the natural world and the people they would encounter. Alongside Harriot sailed John White, an artist whose job was to create visual records of everything they saw. These 2 men, Harriot and White, would prove to be the most valuable members of the expedition in terms of the knowledge they brought back. The fleet didn't sail directly to Roanoke. They stopped first in the Caribbean, as was common for English ships heading to North America. There they engaged in what the English politely called privateering and what the Spanish accurately called piracy. They attacked Spanish ships and settlements, taking supplies and treasure. This might seem like a strange way to begin a colonization venture, but it made economic sense to the English. The expedition could fund itself through plunder. By June, the fleet had reached the Outer Banks. They explored the sounds and islands, eventually choosing Roanoke Island as their base. The island offered certain advantages. It was protected from the open ocean by the Outer Banks. It had fresh water. It was large enough to support a settlement but small enough to defend. But Roanoke Island also had significant disadvantages that would become clear later. The passage through the Outer Banks into the Sound was treacherous, with shifting sandbars that made navigation dangerous even for experienced pilots. Larger ships couldn't enter the Sound at all. This meant that any colony on Roanoke would be difficult to resupply. Grenville, having established the initial settlement, left Lane in charge with about 100 men and sailed back to England in August. The plan was for Grenville to return with supplies, but Lane and his men would have to survive until then on their own. The winter of 1585 to 1586 was difficult for Lane's colony. Relations with the local Roanoke people, initially friendly, deteriorated. The reasons for this deterioration were complex, involving cultural misunderstandings, English demands for food that the natives couldn't or wouldn't provide, and probably English arrogance and insensitivity. Lane grew paranoid, believing the Roanoke people were planning to attack the colony. In what he saw as a preemptive strike, Lane led a raid that killed the chief Wingina and several others. This act of violence destroyed whatever trust had existed. The Roanoke people withdrew their cooperation. The English colonists found themselves isolated and running out of food. During this time, though, Harriot and White were doing remarkable work. Harriot learned the Algonquian language and recorded extensive information about native culture, agriculture, and beliefs. White created watercolour paintings of villages, people, plants, animals, and fish. Their work provided Europe with its first detailed, relatively accurate information about the native peoples of the Carolina coast. Harriot's account, published later as A Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia, is surprisingly respectful of native peoples for its time. He described their agricultural practices, their religious beliefs, their social structures, not with contempt, but with genuine interest. He understood, perhaps better than most of his contemporaries, that these were complex societies with their own logic and wisdom. White's paintings are even more remarkable. They show individual people with dignity and detail. These aren't generic savages, but specific individuals with specific clothing, hairstyles, and expressions. When we look at White's paintings today, we're seeing actual people who lived 400 years ago, seen through the eyes of an artist who tried, within the limitations of his culture and time, to really see them. By June of 1586, Lane's colony was in desperate condition. They were saved, ironically, by the appearance of Sir Francis Drake's fleet. Drake had been raiding Spanish settlements in the Caribbean and stopped at Roanoke on his way back to England. When Drake offered to take the colonists home, Lane accepted immediately. The entire colony abandoned Roanoke Island and sailed back to England. This first attempt at permanent English settlement in America had failed, lasting less than a year. But Raleigh wasn't ready to give up. The information brought back by Harriet and White convinced him that Virginia could support an English colony. The failure, he believed, wasn't in the location, but in the approach. What was needed wasn't a military garrison, but actual families, people planning to make permanent homes, and so he began planning a third expedition, one that would include women and children, one that would become the Lost Colony. The colonists who gathered in Portsmouth in the spring of 1587 were different from those who had sailed before. This time, entire families were making the journey. There were women, at least 17 of them, possibly more, and children. These weren't soldiers on a military campaign. These were people planning to build lives. John White, the artist from the previous expedition, was named governor of this new colony. Raleigh's plan was ambitious. The colonists weren't supposed to settle at Roanoke Island at all. That location had proven problematic. Instead, they were to sail north to the Chesapeake Bay, where they would establish their colony on better land with better harbours. Among the colonists were people from various backgrounds. Some were gentlemen seeking opportunity, others were craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, bricklayers, whose skills would be essential for building a settlement. There were farmers who knew how to work the land. The diversity of skills suggests this was a thoughtfully planned community, not a haphazard collection of adventurers. We know some of their names. There was Ananias Dare, a tiler and bricklayer travelling with his pregnant wife Eleanor. Eleanor was John White's daughter, which meant Governor White was bringing his own family into danger, a fact that would take on terrible significance later. There was also a man named Dionysius Harvey, and another named Thomas Harris, and John Sampson, and many others whose names survive in the historical record, though we know little else about them. Among the assistants White appointed to help govern the colony was Manteo, the native man who had travelled to England with the first expedition and chosen to return. Manteo's presence is significant. Unlike Wanchese, who had returned with Lane's expedition and then turned against the English, Manteo remained friendly. His people, the Croatoan, lived on an island south of Roanoke. Manteo's decision to join this colony suggests he believed peaceful coexistence was possible. The fleet of 3 ships, the Lion, commanded by Simon Fernandez, along with 2 smaller vessels, left Plymouth on May 8, 1587. The crossing took about 2.5 months, which was typical for the time. We can imagine those weeks at sea, the cramped conditions, the poor food, the constant motion of the waves, the uncertainty of what awaited. For the women, the journey must have been particularly difficult. 17 women, possibly more, in ships designed and crewed by men, in an age when women's needs were rarely prioritised. There were no private quarters. Privacy itself was a luxury the ships couldn't afford, and some of the women were pregnant, facing the journey knowing they would give birth either at sea or in a wilderness settlement. When the ships reached the Outer Banks in late July, something went wrong with the plan. Simon Fernandez, the pilot of the Lion, refused to take the colonists north to the Chesapeake Bay. The historical record isn't entirely clear about why. Some accounts suggest Fernandez wanted to get back to privateering in the Caribbean and saw transporting the colonists all the way to Chesapeake as a waste of time. Others suggest there were disagreements between Fernandez and White about the wisdom of the Chesapeake location. Whatever the reason, the result was that the colonists were put ashore at Roanoke Island. the very place the previous colony had abandoned just over a year before, the place where Lane had killed Chief Wingener, the place where relations with the local people had completely broken down. The colonists found the fort Lane had built, but it was overgrown and partially dismantled. They began the work of repairing it and building houses. It was late summer, which meant they had some time before winter to establish themselves, but not as much time as they would have liked. Despite the inauspicious beginning, there were moments of hope. Manteo was christened on August 13th, becoming the first native person to be baptized into the Church of England in the Americas. The ceremony was a symbol of the peaceful integration the colonists hoped for, even if that hope was perhaps naive. And then, on August 18th, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia Dare, and she became the first English child born in the Americas, Governor White's granddaughter. The historical record preserves this moment with unusual clarity. We know the date, we know the name. We can almost feel the mixture of joy and fear her parents must have felt, welcoming a child into the world in such an uncertain place. But joy was quickly overshadowed by concern. The supplies the colonists had brought were inadequate. The growing season was nearly over. They would need help from England to survive the winter. Someone would have to sail back and organise a relief expedition. The question was, who should go? This decision, made in those last days of August 1587, would determine the fate of everyone who remained. The Roanoke Island the colonists found themselves on, in August of 1587, was a small piece of land, roughly 12 miles long and less than 3 miles wide. It sits in what we now call the Albemarle Pamlico Sound, protected from the Atlantic Ocean by the narrow chain of barrier islands called the Outer Banks. Picture the landscape as the colonists would have seen it. Dense forests of oak, pine and cedar covered most of the island. The understory was thick with vegetation, grapevines, which had so impressed the earlier explorers, along with shrubs and smaller plants. The edges of the island where it met the sound were marshy in places, solid ground in others. The island had no dramatic topography. There were no mountains, no significant hills. It was flat, or nearly so, which meant that water drainage was a constant consideration. Rain had nowhere to flow except into the ground or toward the sound. During wet seasons, parts of the island would have been muddy and difficult to navigate. The sound itself was shallow, which was both advantage and disadvantage. Shallow water meant that large English ships couldn't approach the island directly. Everything had to be ferried in smaller boats, from ships anchored beyond the Outer Banks. But the shallowness also meant the water was warmer, more productive of fish and shellfish, and generally more navigable by small craft. Fresh water came from wells, and perhaps from rainwater collected in barrels. The island had no rivers, no streams of any size. This was a concern the colonists noted. Reliable fresh water is essential for any settlement, and while the water table on Roanoke was generally high, meaning wells didn't need to be deep, the quality and quantity of water available had limits. The colonists set about establishing their settlement in the northern part of the island. They repaired and expanded the earthworks and structures left by Lane's garrison. Archaeological evidence suggests they built houses, probably wattle and daub constructions with thatched roofs, similar to English cottages of the period, but adapted to local materials. They created gardens, planting English seeds they had brought with them. But it was late summer, almost too late for most crops to mature before winter. They would have to rely heavily on trade with native peoples for food, which was problematic given the poisoned relationship Lane had left behind. The work of establishing the colony was hard physical labour. Trees had to be cut for building materials and to clear land for cultivation. Wells had to be dug. Houses had to be raised. Every able-bodied person would have been working, including the women and children. There was no leisure in those first weeks. No time to rest and contemplate their situation. And looming over everything was the awareness that winter was coming. English winters were harsh enough. No one knew what winter in Virginia would bring. They had some information from Lane's expedition, but one winter's observations weren't enough to predict with confidence. Would there be snow? How cold would it get? Would they be able to fish through the winter months, or would the Sound freeze? There was also the question of the native people's attitude. Manteo tried to facilitate communication with his own people, the Croatoan, and that relationship remained friendly. But the Roanoke people, the dominant group in the immediate area, were understandably hostile. Lane had killed their chief. They had no reason to help these new English arrivals, and every reason to be suspicious of their intentions. In those first weeks, there was at least one violent incident. George Howe, one of the assistants White had appointed, was killed while catching crabs alone. He was struck down with arrows, his body left in the shallow water. This death drove home the reality of their vulnerability. They were strangers in a land where they had made enemies before they even arrived. White tried to address this by organising a meeting with the Roanoke people, using Manteo as an intermediary. But the Roanoke wouldn't come to the meeting. They had abandoned their villages near the English settlement and moved inland beyond easy contact. The message was clear. They wanted nothing to do with these new colonists. This isolation, this sense of being unwelcome in a strange land, must have weighed heavily on the colonists. They had come expecting to build a new life. Instead, they found themselves besieged by circumstance, short on supplies, approaching winter, and cut off from friendly contact with the people who actually knew how to thrive in this land. The decision about who should return to England for supplies became urgent, and increasingly all eyes turned to Governor White himself. He knew England. He had the connections. He was the logical choice. But choosing to go meant leaving his daughter and newborn granddaughter behind, and that decision would haunt John White for the rest of his life. John White was an unusual choice for governor in many ways. He wasn't a military man like Lane or Grenville. He was an artist, a gentleman with some education but no real experience leading a colony. His qualification was that he had been to Roanoke before, had seen the land and people, and had survived. In the 16th century, that counted for something. White's writings that survive, primarily his narrative of the 1587 voyage and subsequent events, reveal a man who was observant, detail-oriented, and deeply concerned about the people under his care. He wasn't a distant authority figure. He was personally invested in the colony's success because his own family was part of it. This personal investment became both his strength and his vulnerability. When the colonists insisted that he must be the one to return to England for supplies, White initially refused. His reasons, as he recorded them, were both practical and emotional. He was the governor. His place was with the colony. More importantly, his daughter had just given birth to his grandchild. What kind of father, what kind of grandfather would leave at such a time? The colonists had to essentially force the decision on him. They presented a petition, signed by many of the leading members of the colony, formally requesting that White return to England to ensure proper supplies and support. The language of the petition was carefully constructed to make it clear that this was the colonists' decision, not White's abandonment. Still, White hesitated. He negotiated, he argued, he tried to find alternatives. Perhaps someone else could go, but the colonists were adamant. White had the connections in England, the relationship with Raleigh, the credibility to argue for support. No one else could do what he could do. Finally, in late August 1587, just days after his granddaughter's birth, White agreed to go. The decision was made easier, perhaps, by the certainty that he would return quickly. This was a supply mission, not a farewell. He expected to be back within a few months, certainly before winter set in. He would organise the supplies, load them on ships, and sail back. Simple. Before he left, there were practical matters to arrange. White and the colonists agreed on a signal system. If the colonists had to leave Roanoke Island, they would carve the name of their destination into a tree or post. If they were leaving under duress, if they were in danger, they would add a Maltese cross to the carving. This simple plan seemed reasonable at the time. It would become the source of centuries of speculation. White also left behind personal items, things he valued but couldn't carry on the ship. These included maps, drawings, and other materials from his work as an artist. The fact that he left them suggests how confident he was that he'd return soon. You don't leave valuable work behind unless you're certain you'll be back to retrieve it. The farewell scene, though White never describes it in detail, must have been wrenching. Eleanor saying goodbye to her father, Ananias holding his infant daughter. The other colonists gathering to watch the ship's boat row White out to the waiting vessel beyond the sandbar. Everyone trying to be optimistic, trying to believe this separation would be brief. White sailed on one of the smaller vessels, leaving the colonists with the provisions they had and the hope that more would arrive soon. As the ship cleared the outer banks and headed into the open Atlantic, White must have looked back at the receding coastline, wondering when he would see it again. He couldn't have known that he was entering what would become a waking nightmare. He couldn't have anticipated that forces beyond his control, political forces, military forces, the very winds and weather themselves, would conspire to keep him from returning. He thought he was leaving for a few months. In reality, he was beginning a 3-year ordeal that would define and destroy the rest of his life. The journey back to England was uneventful, which was itself fortunate. White arrived in England in November of 1587. Winter was approaching. So he didn't expect to be able to return to Virginia immediately. Winter crossings of the Atlantic were dangerous. He would organise supplies over the winter and sail in the spring. That was the plan. But 1588 brought something no one had anticipated: the Spanish Armada. And with that threat, all of White's plans for returning to Virginia, for reuniting with his family, for saving the colony, began to unravel in ways he couldn't control. Let's follow White through those increasingly desperate years and understand why his return, when it finally came, arrived far too late. Virginia Dare lived for only a few days in the historical record. She was born on August 18th, 1587, baptized on the 24th, and then disappears from documented history forever. We know her name, her birth date, her parents' names, and nothing else. Everything else about Virginia Dare is speculation, hope, and imagination. But that brief documented existence has been enough to make her perhaps the most famous member of the Lost Colony. She represents all the colonists who vanished, but particularly the children, the innocents who had no say in their parents' decision to sail to a new world. Think about what it meant for Eleanor Dare to give birth in those circumstances. She was in her 20s probably, though we don't know her exact age. She was far from England, far from her mother or any female relatives who might have helped with the birth. The only women present were the other female colonists, and perhaps Manteo's female relatives if relationships had developed that far. Birth in the 16th century was dangerous even in the best circumstances. Many women died in childbirth. Many babies didn't survive their first year. Eleanor was giving birth in a rough settlement, in late summer heat, with limited supplies and no trained midwife, at least not one trained in English methods. The fact that both she and Virginia survived the birth itself was fortunate. We can imagine Eleanor in those first days after the birth. The exhaustion, the joy, the fear. Looking at her daughter and seeing possibilities. Perhaps Virginia would grow up in a new world where life was better, freer, more prosperous than anything England could offer. Or perhaps Eleanor looked at her daughter and felt only fear about what kind of world she had brought this child into. John White, the new grandfather, must have been torn between conflicting emotions. His artistic eye would have recorded every detail of his granddaughter's face. His practical mind would have been calculating supplies, thinking about winter, worrying about the colony's precarious situation. And then, within days of Virginia's birth, having to make the decision to leave, to sail back to England, to abandon his daughter and granddaughter in the hope of saving them. Did White hold Virginia before he left? Did he spend any time with his grandchild, or was he too busy preparing for the voyage? The historical record is silent on these intimate details. We know only that he left, and that he never saw either Eleanor or Virginia again. Virginia Dare's story, or rather, the absence of her story, has become a kind of American myth. In the centuries since the colony's disappearance, she has been the subject of poems, novels, plays, and even operas. Different eras have used her to represent different things. In the 19th century, she was often portrayed as a symbol of white American innocence and pioneering spirit. Some racist narratives imagined her as a beautiful white woman raised by Indians, a fantasy that revealed more about 19th century anxieties about race and civilization than about any historical reality. In the early 20th century, Virginia Dare's name was even used to sell products, from flour to vanilla extract. A stone memorial was erected to her in the 1920s. The Lost Colony outdoor drama, which still performs every summer near the site of the actual colony, makes her a central character, giving her lines and personality that are pure invention. But the real Virginia Dare remains unknowable. If she survived past infancy, what did she become? If the colonists integrated with native peoples, as many historians now believe, Virginia would have grown up in a Native American community. She might have learned Algonquian as her first language, English as a distant second or not at all. She might have married, had children, lived a full life completely outside English civilization. Or she might have died in her first year, or in the first winter, or in any of the 100 ways children died in the 16th century. We have no way of knowing. Her grave, if it exists, has never been found. No artifacts have been definitively linked to her. She remains what she was, the first English child born in America, and then silence. This silence is what makes Virginia Dare's story both frustrating and profound. She exists at the intersection of history and mystery. We know she was real. We know she was born. Beyond that, we enter the territory of imagination and possibility, and perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps Virginia Dare's greatest legacy is the question she represents, the mystery she embodies, the reminder that history is full of lives lived fully and then lost completely to memory. Every vanished person was once as real as we are. Virginia Dare just happens to have a name we remember. Among all the English colonists, one person knew these lands and waters intimately: Manteo. His story is worth understanding because it provides a crucial piece of the puzzle about what might have happened to the lost colony. Manteo was from the Croatoan people, who lived on what is now Hatteras Island, one of the Outer Banks Islands south of Roanoke. His mother was a person of importance in Croatoan society, possibly a Weronsqua, or female chief. This detail matters. In the matrilineal societies common among many Eastern Native American peoples, status and leadership often pass through the female line. Manteo had travelled to England with the first Roanoke expedition in 1584, along with one Cheesy, who was from the Roanoke people. Both men spent time in London, learning English, meeting English nobility, and being questioned extensively about their homeland. It must have been a surreal experience, educated Englishmen peppering them with questions about geography, resources, political structures, religious beliefs. When the opportunity came to return to America, both Manteo and Wanchese took it. But they took very different paths once they arrived. Wanchese returned to his people and became an opponent of English colonization. He had seen England, understood English power and ambitions, and decided his people were better off resisting. This was a reasonable conclusion based on what he had observed. Manteo, however, maintained his alliance with the English. He returned as part of Lane's military expedition in 1585, serving as an interpreter and guide. When that colony failed, and everyone returned to England, Manteo went back to England again, and when the 1587 colony was organised, Manteo chose to join it, returning once more to his homeland. This loyalty to the English is remarkable and deserves consideration. Why did Manteo continue to support colonization? Was it personal friendship with particular English people? Was it a strategic calculation that alliance with England might benefit his people? Did he genuinely believe that English and native peoples could coexist peacefully? We don't know his reasoning, but his actions show consistent commitment. When Manteo returned with the 1587 colonists, he was baptized as a Christian and named Lord of Roanoke by Governor White. This was a formal English title, recognizing Manteo's status. Whether it carried any actual authority is debatable, but it shows that the English were trying, however imperfectly, to incorporate Manteo into their colonial hierarchy. More importantly, Manteo provided a connection to the Croatoan people. While the Roanoke people wanted nothing to do with the English colonists, the Croatoan, partly because of Manteo's influence, remained friendly. This relationship would prove crucial to understanding what happened to the Lost Colony. The Croatoan lived differently from the English in almost every way. Their houses were long structures made of bent saplings covered with bark or mats. They farmed corn, beans, and squash in fields near their villages. They fished extensively, using weirs and traps as well as hooks and spears. They hunted deer in the forests. They gathered oysters, clams, and other shellfish from the sounds. Their society was organised around kinship and clan structures that would have seemed foreign to the English. Leadership was more consensus-based than the hierarchical system the English were used to. Women had more authority and autonomy than English women did. Property, status, and identity passed through the mother's line, not the father's. To English eyes, the Croatoan might have seemed primitive, but their adaptation to the coastal environment was sophisticated. They knew which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties. They knew the patterns of fish migration, the best times for planting, the signs that predicted weather changes. This was knowledge built up over countless generations. If English colonists were going to survive, they needed this knowledge. They needed to learn how to live in this land, and the Croatoan, through Manteo's mediation, were apparently willing to teach, at least to some degree. When White left for England, he left the colonists with this Croatoan connection intact. Manteo was there, a bridge between two cultures. The Croatoan island was only 50 miles south of Roanoke, a manageable distance by boat. If the colonists at Roanoke faced starvation or danger, the Croatoan offered a possible refuge. This becomes important when we consider the word Croatoan carved into the post that White would find 3 years later. It wasn't a mysterious clue. It was exactly what the colonists had promised to do, indicate where they had gone, and where they had gone, the evidence suggests, was to Manteo's people. The mystery isn't really what the word meant. The mystery is why no one went to look for them there, at least not right away, not when it might have mattered. The moment John White's ship sailed beyond the Barrier Islands, leaving Roanoke behind, the governor entered a period of almost unbearable psychological pressure. Every day that passed was another day his daughter and granddaughter and the rest of the colonists survived without the supplies he had promised to bring. Every delay, every obstacle must have felt like personal failure. White arrived in England in November of 1587, as winter was settling in. The timing was unfortunate but not unexpected. Transatlantic voyages in that era followed seasonal patterns. Spring and summer were safer for sailing. Winter meant storms, rough seas, and poor visibility. No one would attempt to return to Virginia until the following spring at the earliest. White spent the winter organising a relief expedition. He worked with Raleigh and other investors, trying to assemble supplies and ships. The list of what the colonists needed was long. Food, of course, but also tools, weapons, cloth, medicine, and all the other necessities for sustaining a settlement. Each item had to be purchased, transported to the port, and loaded onto ships. But even as White worked, larger forces were moving that would make his mission nearly impossible. England and Spain were on the brink of war. King Philip II of Spain, angered by English piracy and religious differences, was assembling the largest naval force Europe had ever seen. The Spanish Armada, as it would be known, consisted of over 100 ships carrying thousands of soldiers. Its purpose was to invade England, depose Queen Elizabeth, and return England to Catholicism. In this context, ships and sailors became military resources. The Crown needed every available vessel for defence. Supplies were diverted to military purposes. White's relief expedition, important as it was to him and the colonists, was not a priority for a nation preparing for invasion. White managed to organise 2 small ships by late April of 1588. These weren't the large supply vessels he'd hoped for, but they could at least carry some provisions and bring back word of the colony's condition. The ships were named the Brave and the Roe. They set sail on April 22nd. What happened next was almost farcical in its cruel futility. The captains of both ships were privateers, more interested in plundering Spanish and French vessels than in reaching Virginia. They sailed south toward Madeira, looking for prizes to capture. When they did encounter other ships, the battles didn't go well. The Brave and the Roe were both damaged and forced to return to England. White, wounded in the fighting, arrived back in England in May. He had been gone less than a month. He was no closer to reaching Virginia than when he started. The colonists, if they were counting on his return, had been disappointed. Another month had passed. Another growing season was beginning without the supplies they needed, and then the Armada came. In July of 1588, the Spanish fleet entered the English Channel. What followed was a running battle lasting more than a week. The English ships, smaller and more manoeuvrable, harassed the Spanish fleet, preventing it from landing. Storms scattered the Armada. Many ships were wrecked on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland as they tried to sail home. It was a decisive English victory, but it left England drained and vigilant. For the rest of 1588 and through 1589, every ship, every sailor, every resource remained focused on defence. The threat from Spain hadn't ended with the Armada's defeat. Philip was already building another fleet. England couldn't afford to let down its guard. White's pleas for ships to sail to Virginia were met with sympathy but no action. The colony would have to wait. Imagine White during these months. Knowing his daughter was far away, possibly starving, possibly under attack, possibly already dead. Knowing that his granddaughter, if she survived, was growing up without him, changing in ways he would never see. Knowing that the colonists were probably cursing his name for abandoning them, even though the abandonment wasn't his choice. White's letters from this period, preserved in the historical record, show a man becoming desperate. He wrote to anyone who might help. He proposed smaller expeditions with just one ship. He offered to pay for supplies himself, though he probably couldn't afford it. He pleaded, he reasoned, he begged. And still the ship stayed in English ports, unavailable for a Virginia voyage. The months stretched into a year, then another year. Each passing season meant another winter the colonists had to survive if they were still alive. Each month made it less likely that they would still be at Roanoke. Waiting. The signal system they had agreed on, carving their destination into a tree, assumed White would return soon. But quote 4 had passed. The colony, if it still existed, would have had to make decisions to adapt, to move possibly, all without White's knowledge or input. He was failing them, and he knew it, and he couldn't stop the failure from happening. The years 1588 through 1590 were among the most dramatic in English history. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 had saved England from invasion, but it hadn't ended the war. Spain and England remained locked in conflict that touched every aspect of English life, including, quite directly, John White's ability to reach his colony. The English strategy against Spain relied heavily on privateering. English ships, operating with letters of marque from the Crown, attacked Spanish shipping and settlements in the Caribbean and along the coasts of Central and South America. This wasn't piracy, or at least the English insisted it wasn't. It was economic warfare, aimed at disrupting the flow of silver and gold from Spanish America to Spain. This privateering was profitable. Ships that captured Spanish treasure could make their owners and crews wealthy. Investors clamoured to fund privateering voyages. Sailors signed up eagerly for the chance at shares of prize money. In this environment, trying to organise a voyage to Virginia purely for relief purposes was nearly impossible. White found himself competing with privateering opportunities for ships, crew, and supplies. Why would a ship owner agree to sail to Virginia, a voyage that promised no profit and considerable risk, when they could sail to the Caribbean with a chance of capturing Spanish gold? The economic logic was clear, even if it meant leaving an English colony without support. Raleigh himself was caught up in these larger events. He was organising expeditions against Spanish interests. He was involved in English politics at the highest level. His Virginia colony, which had once been his primary focus, became one concern among many. He didn't forget the colonists, but he couldn't dedicate resources to them when England's very survival seemed at stake. White continued to try. In 1589, he managed to get passage on a fleet headed for the Caribbean, with the understanding that they would stop at Virginia. But when the fleet reached the West Indies, the captains refused to divert to Virginia. There was privateering to be done, Spanish ships to hunt. White was essentially held hostage to their priorities, unable to force them to honour their agreement. Throughout these years, we should imagine the psychological toll on White. He was living in a kind of limbo between hope and despair. As long as he didn't know the colony's fate, he could imagine they had survived. But every passing month made survival less likely. If the colonists had run out of food in the first winter, they might have all died in 1588. If they had been attacked by hostile native peoples, the end might have come quickly. If they had tried to sail back to England in desperation, they could have been lost at sea. Or, and this was the hope White clung to, they might have successfully integrated with the Croatoan or other friendly native peoples. They might have learned to farm and fish in the native style. They might have built houses, raised families, created a hybrid community that combined English and native elements. Eleanor might be alive, raising Virginia to speak both English and Algonquian. This was possible. White couldn't let himself stop believing it was possible, but possibility wasn't certainty. And as 1589 turned into 1590, even White must have begun to accept that whatever he found when he finally reached Roanoke, it wouldn't be the colony he had left. Too much time had passed. The colonists would have had to adapt, to change, to make choices without him. The settlement he remembered was gone, whether its people had survived or not. Meanwhile, life in England went on. People forgot about the Virginia colony, or never knew about it to begin with. It wasn't a matter of cruelty or indifference. England was preoccupied with immediate threats and concerns. A colony across the ocean, small and remote, simply wasn't a priority for most people. Even Raleigh's interest in Virginia was shifting. His attempts at colonization had been expensive and so far had produced no return on investment. The colonies had failed twice. They had brought back no gold, no valuable trade goods, no new routes to Asia. From a purely economic perspective, Virginia was looking like a poor investment. But finally, in 1590, White managed to secure passage on a privateering voyage that agreed to stop at Virginia. It wasn't ideal. The ship's primary purpose was plunder, not relief. But White was in no position to be choosy. After 3 years of delays and frustrations, he would finally return to Roanoke Island. He would finally learn what had become of his daughter, his granddaughter, and the colonists who had trusted him to return quickly with supplies. The voyage departed in March of 1590. White wouldn't reach Roanoke until August, 3 years almost to the day since he'd left. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the morning of August 15th, 1590, John White stood on the deck of the Hopewell as it approached the Outer Banks. It had been exactly 3 years since he had sailed away from Roanoke. 3 years since he had seen his daughter and granddaughter. 3 years of frustration, failure, and fading hope. The voyage from England had taken 5 months. The ships had stopped in the Caribbean for privateering, as White had known they would. There had been battles, delays, and detours. 2 members of the crew had been killed in fighting with Spanish ships. But finally, reluctantly, the captain had agreed to head north to Virginia. as they sailed along the Outer Banks. White saw smoke rising from Roanoke Island. His heart must have leapt. Smoke meant fires. Fires meant people. The colonists were there. They had survived. After 3 years of not knowing, he was about to be reunited with them. The ships anchored offshore on August 15th, but rough seas prevented them from attempting a landing that day. White had to wait through the night, watching the island, seeing no movement, no signals. The smoke he'd seen earlier had dissipated. Still, there was tomorrow. One more night of waiting after 3 years was bearable. On August 16th, the boats were prepared for landing. But tragedy struck before they even reached the island. One of the boats overturned in the surf. Several men drowned, including Captain Edward Spicer, who had been sympathetic to White's mission. The deaths cast a dark shadow over what should have been a moment of reunion and relief. Nevertheless, the remaining boats made it through the surf and reached the island. White describes what happened next in his journal with painful detail. The landing party made their way to where the settlement should have been. They found the area overgrown. The houses were gone. The fort's earthworks remained, but the interior had been dismantled, and there, carved into a post at the entrance to the fort, was the word Croatoan. White examined the carving carefully. The letters were clear, deliberately carved. There was no Maltese cross, which meant, according to the system they had agreed upon, that the colonists had not left under duress. They had moved to Croatoan Island, to Manteo's people, by choice. This was good news, or at least not the worst news. It suggested a planned relocation rather than a desperate flight. But there were troubling signs as well. White found some of his own possessions scattered and damaged. The maps and drawings he had left behind, carefully packed in chests, had been dug up and ruined by rain. Books were torn, armour was rusted. It looked as though someone had searched through the colonists' belongings, possibly native peoples investigating after the English had left, or perhaps even the colonists themselves taking what they needed before moving. White and the search party explored further. They found another tree with CRO carved into it, apparently the beginning of the same word, Croatoan. They found no graves, which was both reassuring and puzzling. If colonists had died, where had they been buried? The absence of graves suggested either that everyone had survived long enough to relocate, or that the dead had been buried somewhere else, somewhere the search party didn't find. What they didn't find was any sign of a recent habitation. No warm fires, no fresh footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there in days, weeks, or possibly months. The colony had clearly been abandoned, and the abandonment wasn't recent. White wanted to sail immediately to Croatoan Island, only about 50 miles south along the Outer Banks. If the colonists had gone there, as the carved word indicated, that's where he would find them. That's where Eleanor and Virginia and all the others would be possibly safe, possibly integrated with Manteo's people. But the ship's captain refused. A storm was coming, he said. The weather was deteriorating. They needed to head south to safer anchorage in the Caribbean, and would return to search Croatoan in the spring. White argued, pleaded, even offered to pay for the detour. The captain was unmoved. They would sail south now before the storm hit. White was forced to agree. They sailed away from the Outer Banks on August 17th, just 2 days after first sighting Roanoke. The plan was to winter in the Caribbean and return in the spring of 1591 to continue the search at Croatoan Island. White clung to this plan, to the hope it represented. He would find them in the spring, just a few more months of waiting. After 3 years, he could wait a few more months. The word Croatoan has become one of the most famous clues in American history, but in White's time, it wasn't really a clue at all. It was a clear message following the exact procedure he and the colonists had agreed upon. If they had to leave Roanoke, they would indicate their destination. They did exactly that. Croatoan was a place. Specifically, it was what the English called the island where Manteo's people lived, the island we now know as Hatteras Island. It was about 50 miles south of Roanoke along the Outer Banks. The Croatoan people were the native group who had remained friendly to the English throughout all the expeditions. They had Manteo, who spoke English and had strong ties to the colonists. If the Roanoke colonists needed to relocate and wanted to go somewhere safe, Croatoan was the logical choice. The word itself was carved clearly and deliberately. White noted that the letters were quote, _5_. This wasn't a desperate scratch in the bark. Someone had taken time to carve the letters properly, which suggests a planned, orderly relocation rather than a panicked flight. The absence of the Maltese cross that should have indicated distress was equally significant. White had been clear about this part of the agreement. If they were leaving because of danger, they would add the cross. They didn't add it. This suggested that the move to Croatoan had been strategic rather than desperate. So why has Croatoan become such a mystery in popular imagination? Partly because White never got to search Croatoan Island in 1590. The ships left, planning to return. But they never did return. White never got closure. He never learned what happened to the colonists after they left Roanoke, and partly the mystery exists because later searchers either didn't know about Croatoan or didn't search there thoroughly. When the Jamestown colonists arrived in 1607, 20 years after the Roanoke colony, they heard rumours and stories about English people living among native populations. But they never mounted a serious search expedition to Croatoan specifically. There's also a linguistic confusion that has deepened the mystery. The word Croatoan appears in different spellings in different documents. Sometimes it's one word, sometimes two. Sometimes it refers to the island, sometimes to the people. This variation has led some people to think the word was mysterious, or coded when really it was just subject to the inconsistent spelling practices of the 16th century. In more recent centuries, especially as the Roanoke story became part of American mythology, Croatoan took on supernatural overtones. Writers imagined it as a curse or a supernatural warning. This is completely invented. To John White and the colonists, it was simply the name of the place where Manteo's people lived, the place where they had gone for safety or survival. Archaeological evidence has supported the Croatoan interpretation. Excavations on Hatteras Island have found European artifacts from the late 16th century. Brass and copper items, pieces of what might be English tools or jewellery, and other objects that suggest English presence. These aren't conclusive proof that the Roanoke colonists lived there, but they're consistent with that theory. There's also genetic evidence, though it's somewhat controversial. Some members of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, who have traditionally claimed descent from the Lost Colony, carry genetic markers that could indicate European ancestry from around the time period of the colony. The Lumbee have oral traditions about English ancestors who joined their communities. Again, this isn't proof, but it fits the pattern. The Croatoan explanation is probably the simplest and most likely answer to what happened to the Lost Colony. They ran low on supplies. 3 years passed without White's return. The location at Roanoke Island had proven problematic. Relations with the nearby Roanoke people were hostile. The Croatoan people, through Manteo, offered an alternative. So the colonists packed what they could carry, abandoned what they couldn't, carved their destination as they had promised White they would, and moved south to Croatoan Island. There they would have found a functioning native community willing to accept them. They would have learned native farming and fishing techniques. They would have built houses in the native style, or been given houses. Their children would have grown up speaking Algonquian as readily as English. Over time, the two groups would have blended together, becoming a hybrid community. This isn't a mystery, is what the evidence suggests. The mystery is why no one came to look for them, or why those who did come didn't search thoroughly enough, or didn't leave us records of what they found. The colonists told us where they went. We just never finished the search. John White's plan to return in the spring of 1591 and search Croatoan Island never materialised. The ships that had taken him away from Roanoke sailed to the Caribbean and then back to England. White was dropped off in England with promises that a Virginia search expedition would be organised. Those promises, like so many promises regarding the colony, came to nothing. The problem was still the same: economics and priorities. The war with Spain continued. Privateering was profitable. Relief voyages to Virginia were not. Ship owners and captains had no incentive to sail to a remote location to search for colonists who might already be dead. White had no authority to command ships. He could only beg, and his begging was no longer persuasive. Raleigh, the colony's sponsor, was losing interest in Virginia. He had spent a considerable fortune on 3 failed expeditions. None had produced returns. The last colonists had vanished. He was starting to look elsewhere for opportunities. Within a few years, he would be focused on Guyana in South America, where he believed there were cities of gold. Virginia, with its mysteries and failures, was becoming part of his past. White seems to have made one last attempt to reach Virginia in 1593, joining another privateering expedition with the hope they would stop at Croatoan. They didn't. By this time, White was in his 50s, not wealthy, not particularly influential, and running out of options. He eventually settled in Ireland on property belonging to Raleigh and lived out his days there. His last known writing about the colony dates to 1593. After that, silence. He probably died in the late 1590s or early 1600s, never knowing what became of Eleanor and Virginia. For more than a decade after White's failed return, no English ships visited the North Carolina coast looking for the colonists. The Roanoke colony simply faded from active concern. People in England who knew about it probably assumed the colonists were dead. There was no pressure to mount a search, no public demand for answers. The next English colonisation attempt in the region came in 1607, when the Virginia Company established Jamestown, much farther north in Chesapeake Bay. The Jamestown colonists had heard stories about the Roanoke colony. John Smith, Jamestown's famous leader, was curious about what had happened. He gathered information from native peoples about where the lost colonists might be. Smith heard multiple accounts. Some native sources told him there were Europeans living at a place called Ocanahoan. Others spoke of English people who had been killed by the powerful Powhatan Confederacy on orders of their chief, also named Powhatan. These stories were contradictory and impossible for Smith to verify without mounting expeditions into potentially hostile territory. Smith did organise some limited searches, but they were half-hearted and inconclusive. The Jamestown colony was struggling to survive itself. Food was scarce. Disease was rampant. Relations with the surrounding native peoples were tense. In this context, searching for colonists who had disappeared 20 years earlier was not a priority. One tantalising piece of evidence came from George Percy, another Jamestown colonist. Percy claimed to have seen a native boy with perfect yellow hair, suggesting European ancestry. Could this have been a descendant of the Roanoke colonists? Possibly, but Percy didn't pursue the lead. And the boy disappeared from the historical record. Later expeditions from Jamestown gathered more rumours. Powhatan himself reportedly told the English that he had killed colonists from Roanoke because they posed a threat. He supposedly showed English items taken from the colonists as proof. But how reliable was this information? Powhatan had his own political reasons for shaping the narrative. Perhaps he wanted the English to fear him. Perhaps he was boasting of a conquest to increase his prestige. Or perhaps he was telling the truth. The fundamental problem was that by the time anyone from England was in a position to conduct a thorough search, too many years had passed. If the colonists had integrated with native communities, they would have blended in. If they had died, the evidence had long since disappeared. If they had moved far inland, they were beyond reach. And so the search that should have happened in 1590 or 1591, when the trail was still warm, has never happened at all. The colonists carved their destination. They followed the plan. They waited, probably, for White to come find them. But White never came, and by the time other English arrivals showed interest, the chance of finding answers had passed. The moment for a successful search had been lost, and with it, any certainty about the colonists' fate. Archaeology can't tell us everything about the lost colony, but it can tell us some things. Over the past century, researchers have excavated sites on Roanoke Island and Hatteras Island, carefully sifting through soil for fragments of the past. What they've found paints a partial picture, like a puzzle with most pieces missing but enough present to suggest the full image. On Roanoke Island itself, archaeologists have located what they believe was the site of the fort and settlement. The location matches descriptions from the historical record. They found evidence of ditches and earthworks that would have formed the fort's perimeter. They found post holes where buildings stood. This confirms that yes, there was a settlement here, exactly where the document said it was, but the artifacts from Roanoke Island are sparse. A few pieces of pottery, some nails, fragments of bottles and glassware. These are consistent with English presence in the 1580s, but there aren't many of them. This scarcity suggests either that the colonists took most of their possessions when they left, or that the site has been heavily disturbed over the centuries. More intriguing are the finds at Hatteras Island, ancient Croatoan territory. Here archaeologists have discovered a number of European artifacts from the late 16th century. Pieces of copper and brass that appear to be fragments of English tools or trade goods. A fragment of what might be a rapier hilt, a type of sword English gentlemen carried, ring fragments, pieces of writing slates. These artifacts don't prove the Roanoke colonists lived at Croatoan, but they're consistent with that interpretation. European goods reach native communities through trade, so the presence of English artifacts alone isn't conclusive. But the concentration of late 16th century European materials at this particular location, combined with the historical connection to Manteo and the Croatoan carving, suggests something more than casual trade. In recent decades, researchers have used new technologies to search for evidence. Ground-penetrating radar can detect buried structures without digging. Careful analysis of soil chemistry can indicate where people lived, where they cooked, where they buried waste. These methods have revealed potential native and European structures on both Roanoke and Hatteras Islands, though interpreting the results requires caution. One particularly interesting find came from analysis of a 16th century map that John White had drawn. Researchers examining the map under special lighting discovered hidden symbols that White had apparently drawn and then covered with patches. One of these symbols appeared at a location inland from Roanoke Island. When archaeologists investigated that location, they found pottery and other evidence of European presence from the late 16th century. This suggests some colonists, or perhaps just some of their possessions, made it to this inland site. Was this a fallback location? A secondary settlement? Evidence of the colonists' dispersal after leaving Roanoke Island? The findings raise as many questions as they answer. The archaeological evidence also tells us something about what happened before the colonists disappeared. They clearly spent time at Roanoke Island. They built structures, they dug wells, they created storage pits. This was genuine habitation, not just temporary camping. They were trying to establish a permanent settlement. But archaeology also confirms that the settlement was small and poorly supplied. The number of European artifacts is far smaller than what you'd expect from over 100 people living for several years. This suggests either that the colony had very few material goods to begin with, or that they were careful to preserve and reuse everything they had. There's also evidence of interaction with native peoples. Trade goods have been found that could have come from exchanges between colonists and native communities. The colonists weren't living in complete isolation. They were engaging with the people around them, at least economically. What archaeology can't tell us is more frustrating. It can't tell us individual stories. It can't tell us whether Eleanor and Virginia survived. It can't tell us whether the integration with native communities was voluntary and peaceful, or desperate and coerced. Artifacts don't carry emotions. They don't record conversations or motivations. The soil keeps some secrets. Organic materials, cloth, leather, wood, bone, decompose in the humid Carolina climate. If the colonists wrote letters or kept journals after White left, those documents are long gone. If they built wooden structures at Croatoan, Those structures have rotted away. If they died and were buried, their graves, unmarked and unprotected, have been lost to time and weather. Archaeology gives us fragments. It confirms the basic outline of the story. It suggests directions for further research, but it doesn't give us the ending we want. For that, we have to turn to other types of evidence, to genetics, to oral traditions, to the stories that have been passed down through generations of people who might carry the colonists' blood in their veins. The theory that the lost colonists survived by integrating with native communities isn't speculation based on hope. It's a conclusion drawn from multiple types of evidence that, when considered together, form a compelling picture. Let's explore what this integration might have looked like and why it's the most likely explanation for what happened. First, consider the practical reality. The colonists at Roanoke faced a stark choice by the time they carved Croatoan into that post. White had been gone for months, probably over a year, certainly longer than he had promised. Supplies were low or exhausted. The location was problematic. Winter was coming or had come. They needed help. The Croatoan through Manteo offered that help. It wasn't charity exactly. Native communities understood reciprocity. Perhaps the colonists had items to trade, metal tools, cloth, other English goods. Perhaps the Croatoan saw value in having English allies, people who might speak for them to future English arrivals. Perhaps Manteo felt obligated to help, having brought the English to this land in the first place. Whatever the motivations, the colonists had a choice between staying at Roanoke and probably dying, or moving to Croatoan and possibly surviving. When framed that way, the decision becomes obvious. Moving to Croatoan would have meant adopting native ways of living. The colonists couldn't bring their English houses with them. They would have lived in native-style structures, bark-covered longhouses or smaller dwellings made from bent saplings and woven mats. These buildings would have seemed crude to English eyes, but they were well adapted to the climate and available materials. Food would have come from native methods of agriculture, hunting and fishing. The colonists would have learned to plant corn, beans and squash together in mounds, a technique far more productive than anything they knew from England. They would have learned to fish with weirs and traps. They would have gathered oysters, clams and other shellfish. They would have hunted deer using techniques the Croatoan had perfected over generations. Language would have been a barrier initially, but one that could be overcome. Children are especially good at learning languages. Virginia Dare, if she survived, would have grown up speaking Algonquian fluently, probably better than she spoke English. Within a generation, the linguistic distinction between English and Croatoan would have blurred. Cultural identity would have blurred too. Children born to English parents but raised in a native community would have identified more with that community than with a faraway England they'd never seen. They would have participated in native ceremonies, believed in native spiritual traditions, married native partners. The cultural markers that defined them as, quote, 10 would have gradually faded. This process of integration, we might call it assimilation. Though that word carries modern political connotations we should be careful about, would have taken time. The first generation of colonists, the adults who arrived in 1587, would have always remained somewhat English. They would have remembered England, spoken English among themselves, perhaps taught their children English songs or stories. But their children would have been different. Virginia Dare's generation, growing up in a native community, would have been culturally native with perhaps some English heritage they knew about but didn't strongly identify with. And their children, the third generation, would have been indistinguishable from other members of the Croatoan community. This is how cultures blend. Not through dramatic, documented events, but through daily life, through marriage, through children who carry multiple heritages but grow up in one culture. Within 50 years, within 2 generations, the _quote, _11_ would have disappeared not through death but through absorption. Is there evidence this happened? Yes, though it's complicated. The Lumbee tribe of North Carolina has long claimed descent from the Lost Colony. Many Lumbee have family names that match names from the colony roster. Dare, Cooper, Sampson, others. These could be coincidences, or they could be evidence of English ancestry. Genetic studies have shown some Lumbee carry markers suggesting European ancestry, though dating that ancestry precisely is difficult. The oral traditions within the Lumbee community speak of English ancestors who joined them generations ago. These traditions aren't proof, but they deserve consideration. Perhaps the most compelling evidence is simply the lack of evidence for alternative theories. If the colonists had all died at Roanoke, there would likely be graves, mass burial sites, evidence of disaster. None has been found. If they had been killed by hostile native groups, there would be accounts, boasts of victory, evidence of conflict. Again, the evidence is thin. The survival through integration theory fits the facts better than any alternative. It explains Croatoan. It explains the artifacts found at Hatteras Island. It explains the absence of graves at Roanoke. It explains the later reports of English people living among native communities. It's not a mystery. It's the solution the colonists themselves told us, if we're willing to listen to the message they carved into wood and left behind. The Powhatan Confederacy, which controlled much of the territory around Chesapeake Bay in the early 17th century, had stories about English people who had lived among the native peoples in the region. These stories, relayed to the Jamestown colonists, provide another piece of the puzzle about what might have happened to some or all of the Roanoke colonists. Chief Powhatan himself, the powerful leader who dominated the region when Jamestown was established, spoke of having killed English people. The accounts we have suggest he claimed to have ordered the destruction of colonists who had been living at a place the English called Okanahoan or Panawike. These place names are difficult to locate precisely on modern maps, but they were somewhere in the region south of Chesapeake Bay. Why would Powhatan kill English colonists if they were indeed living peacefully among native communities? The politics of the region provides a possible answer. The Powhatan Confederacy was an expanding power in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Powhatan himself had brought many previously independent groups under his control through a combination of military force, political marriages, and strategic alliances. If English colonists were living among a native group that Powhatan wanted to dominate, those English people represented a complication. They might have encouraged resistance. They had weapons and knowledge that could be useful to Powhatan's enemies, or perhaps Powhatan simply saw them as foreigners whose presence threatened his control. The timing of this alleged attack is significant. Some accounts suggest it happened just before the Jamestown colonists arrived in 1607, 20 years after the Roanoke colony was established. If Roanoke colonists had survived by integrating with native communities, by 1607 they would have had children and possibly grandchildren. Whole families with mixed English and native heritage would have existed. A massacre of these people would have been a tragedy, the final cruel twist in the Roanoke story. After surviving for 2 decades, after successfully adapting to a new world, after building lives and families, to be killed not by the original hardships, but by the political ambitions of a powerful chief, it's almost unbearably sad. But how reliable are these accounts? We have to consider the sources critically. Most of what we know about Powhatan's claims comes through English intermediaries who wrote them down. They were translating from Algonquian to English, interpreting cultural contexts they didn't fully understand, and filtering information through their own biases and assumptions. Powhatan might have had reasons to exaggerate or fabricate. He might have wanted to frighten the Jamestown colonists, to demonstrate his power and willingness to use violence against English people. He might have been consolidating his authority by claiming credit for eliminating potential rivals. Or he might have been completely truthful, describing events exactly as they happened. There are other possibilities too. Perhaps different groups of Roanoke colonists went to different locations. Some might have gone to Croatoan and survived there in relative peace. Others might have tried to reach Chesapeake Bay, where they were supposed to establish their colony in the first place, and encountered Powhatan's forces there. The colony might have split up with different groups experiencing different fates. We should also consider the perspective of the native peoples who harboured English colonists, taking in over 100 foreigners, providing food and shelter, teaching survival skills. This would have been a significant commitment. The native communities that did this showed remarkable generosity, or at least remarkable willingness to try coexistence. But that generosity might have had limits. If the English colonists proved difficult, if they didn't contribute to the community, if they caused problems, the welcome might have worn out. Or if larger political forces like Powhatan's expansion threatened the community harbouring the English, difficult decisions would have had to be made. The oral histories that have survived among various native communities in the region are fragmentary and difficult to verify. Stories passed down through generations change in the telling. Details are lost or added. Events from different times become conflated. What we're left with are echoes and shadows. Hints of events that might have happened but can't be confirmed. What seems clear is that some English people were living among native communities in the region in the decades after the Roanoke colony was established. Whether these were Roanoke colonists specifically, or other English people who had arrived by different means or a combination, remains uncertain. What also seems likely is that these English people ultimately did not survive as a distinct group. Whether through violence, disease, or gradual integration and loss of separate identity, they disappeared from history, leaving only stories that might or might not preserve truth. When the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery sailed into Chesapeake Bay in April of 1607, carrying the colonists who had established Jamestown, they were entering a land that might have already held English people. The Roanoke colonists, if any survived, would have been in their 30s, 40s, or 50s by then. Their children would have been a new generation, born in America, shaped by American experiences. The Jamestown colonists knew about Roanoke. The story of the lost colony was part of their context, part of their awareness of what could go wrong with colonization. Some of them probably hoped to find survivors. Others probably assumed the Roanoke colonists were long dead. None of them made finding the lost colony a priority. At least not initially. Jamestown had its own desperate struggles. The location they chose for their settlement, while defensible, was swampy and mosquito-infested. Disease struck quickly, food ran short. Relations with the Powhatan Confederacy were tense from the beginning. The colonists were poorly prepared for the work of building a settlement. Many were gentlemen who had never done manual labour. Others were specialists in trades that proved less useful than basic farming and building skills. In the winter of 1609 to 1610, the period known as the Starving Time, things got truly dire. Of the roughly 500 colonists in Jamestown at the start of winter, only about 60 survived to spring. People resorted to eating dogs, cats, rats, and eventually even the bodies of the dead. It was a horror that makes the Roanoke colony's disappearance seem almost peaceful by comparison. In this context, searching for colonists who had vanished 20 years earlier wasn't realistic. The Jamestown colonists were focused on their own survival, hour by hour, day by day. They couldn't mount expeditions into potentially hostile territory, looking for people who might not exist. But there was curiosity. John Smith, who emerged as Jamestown's practical leader despite not being its official governor, actively gathered information about the lost colony. He questioned native peoples about English people who might be living among them. He recorded what he heard, creating a documentary record that's valuable even if it's incomplete and second-hand. Smith heard the stories about Powhatan having killed English colonists. He heard about English people living at various locations in the region. He tried to verify these reports, but his ability to investigate was limited by the dangerous political situation. Powhatan controlled most of the surrounding territory. Venturing into that territory without Powhatan's permission was risky. There were moments when the two English colonies in Virginia, the vanished Roanoke and the struggling Jamestown, almost connected across the 20-year gap between them. If Smith's information was accurate, if Roanoke survivors were indeed living just a few days' journey away, if Jamestown had been stable enough to mount a serious search expedition, the mystery might have been solved in 1608 or 1609. But the connection never happened. Jamestown was too unstable, too focused on immediate survival. The intelligence about Roanoke survivors was too uncertain, too fragmentary to justify the risk. And so the years passed, and the window of opportunity closed. By the time Jamestown stabilized enough to potentially search for Roanoke survivors, too much time had passed. Anyone who had been an adult in 1587 would be elderly or dead by 1610 or 1615. Their children would be fully integrated into native communities. The cultural memory of being English colonists would be fading, becoming family history rather than lived identity. Jamestown itself provides a kind of alternative timeline for what might have happened at Roanoke. The Jamestown colonists struggled terribly, but survived because they received regular supply ships from England. When supplies were delayed, people died in large numbers. When leadership failed, disaster followed. When disease struck, the colony teetered on the edge of collapse. The Roanoke colonists had none of Jamestown's advantages: no supply ships, no additional colonists arriving with fresh provisions, no communication with England. And yet the evidence suggests they survived longer than Jamestown probably would have under similar circumstances. They did this by doing what the Jamestown colonists were initially too proud or too stubborn to do: adapt to native ways of living and integrate with native communities. Jamestown eventually succeeded as a colony, becoming the foundation of English Virginia. But its success came at enormous human cost and required sustained support from England. Roanoke, cut off and abandoned, might actually have succeeded in its own way, by transforming from an English colony into a hybrid community. The irony is that this very success, this adaptation and integration, made the colonists disappear from English records. They survived by becoming invisible to English eyes. We don't have journals or letters from the Roanoke colonists after John White left. They didn't leave written accounts of their experiences, but we can imagine the stories they must have told each other in those years after White sailed away. Stories that gave meaning to their situation. Stories that helped them make sense of their abandonment and survival. In the first months after White's departure, they probably told hopeful stories. The governor will return in the spring. He's organising supplies right now. He wouldn't abandon his own daughter and granddaughter. Be patient. Help is coming. As fall turned to winter in that first year, the stories might have shifted to explain the delay. Perhaps storms prevented the crossing. Perhaps White fell ill. Perhaps the ships needed repairs. There are a dozen reasonable explanations. He'll come when he can. We just have to survive until then. The second summer without White would have required different stories. Something must have gone wrong, but it's temporary. War with Spain, maybe. All English ships pressed into service. The governor is trying to get here, but forces beyond his control prevent it. We can't give up hope. By the third year, hope would have been harder to sustain. The stories might have become stories about themselves rather than about White's return. We're stronger than we thought. We've learned things our English neighbours could never imagine. We're building something new here, something that doesn't depend on ships from England. This is our home now. We make our own fate. Eleanor Dare might have told stories to Virginia about her grandfather, the artist and explorer. Stories about England, about London, about a queen and castles, and a world across the ocean that Virginia would never see. Did Eleanor keep those stories alive as Virginia grew older? Did she teach Virginia to speak English, or did that language fade as Algonquian became their daily tongue? The colonists who had been to England, and several of them had, including some who had served in Lane's garrison, would have told stories about that world. But would their children have believed these stories? If you've never seen a stone building more than 1 story high, can you really imagine Westminster Abbey? If you've never seen a city, can you conceive of London's crowded streets? The stories might have become mythology rather than memory, mixing truth with elaboration, until the children who grew up in the native community heard about England the way they heard about the spirit world, as a place that existed but was beyond direct experience. Manteo must have told stories too. He had been to England twice. He had seen the Queen. He had walked in London. But Manteo had also been born in the native world. He understood both cultures. His stories might have been bridges, helping the colonists understand the world they now lived in by comparing it to the world they'd left. The native peoples who took in the colonists had their own stories. Stories about how the world came to be, about the spirits that inhabited the land and water, about their ancestors and the great deeds they had done. As the colonists integrated, they would have heard these stories, learned them, perhaps even come to believe them. Cultural transformation works through stories as much as through any other mechanism. There would have been stories about the decision to leave Roanoke Island. Who argued for staying? Who pushed for moving to Croatoan? How was the decision made? Was it unanimous or contentious? We don't know, but the colonists certainly discussed it, debated it, and eventually told stories about it to explain their choice to themselves and others. The carving of Croatoan into the post was itself a kind of story. It was a message, but it was also a statement of identity and decision. We are going to Croatoan. We are choosing this path. This is what we want White to know. The act of carving those letters was purposeful, symbolic, a way of asserting control over their narrative even as they were forced to change their plans. If the colonists lived for decades after leaving Roanoke, they would have told stories about the old days at the island. Remember when we first arrived? Remember Virginia's birth? Remember the hardships we endured? These stories would have become part of family history, told and retold, changing in each telling. And eventually, perhaps, the stories would have stopped being about being English colonists and become simply stories about ancestors. The specificity of Roanoke, of White's departure, of England itself, would have faded into a general sense of, we came from somewhere else. A long time ago. That's how cultural memory works over generations. Details blur, meanings change. What seemed vitally important to one generation becomes barely remembered by the next. Archaeological work at potential lost colony sites continues into the present day, and occasionally discoveries capture public attention, offering tantalizing hints about the colonists' fate. These modern discoveries remind us that the story isn't entirely lost, that fragments of evidence remain in the soil waiting to be found. One of the more intriguing discoveries came from excavations at a site on Hatteras Island, the historical Croatoan territory. Archaeologists found a gold signet ring, the kind a gentleman of the Elizabethan era might wear. The ring bore what appeared to be heraldic symbols, though worn and difficult to interpret clearly. Could this ring have belonged to one of the colonists? It's possible, though proving it definitively is difficult. Rings don't carry labels, they don't announce their owners' names. Even if the ring definitely came from the late 16th century and definitely came from England, it might have reached Hatteras Island through trade rather than through the presence of colonists. Native peoples traded extensively along the coast. A ring could have travelled far from its original owner. Still, the ring fits a pattern. When you find late 16th century English artefacts at Croatoan, at a location that the historical record tells us the colonists said they were going, it's reasonable to suspect a connection. The ring isn't proof, but it's consistent with the theory that some or all of the colonists lived at Croatoan for some period. Other artifacts from Hatteras Island excavations include pieces of copper and brass that might be fragments of English tools or trade goods. There are pieces of slate that could be writing slates, though any writing on them has long since worn away. There are fragments of rapier swords, of English pottery, of items that suggest English presence. Again, none of these items proves the lost colony connection definitively, but the concentration of late 16th century English materials at this specific location is striking. If these artifacts came only through trade, we'd expect them to be more scattered, to show up at many different native sites. Instead, we see a clustering at Croatoan, exactly where the colonists said they were going. In recent years, technology has provided new tools for investigation. Ground-penetrating radar can detect buried structures without excavation. Soil analysis can reveal chemical signatures that indicate human habitation. Genetic analysis of modern populations can identify ancestry connections. DNA extracted from ancient bones, when bones can be found, can be compared to genetic databases. These technologies raise hopes that definitive proof might still be found. Perhaps a burial site exists somewhere, preserved by fortunate conditions, containing bones that could be tested for European ancestry. Perhaps structures remain buried at Croatoan or another location, structures that would prove English habitation. Perhaps genetic analysis of the Lumbee or other regional populations will confirm Native American and European ancestry from precisely the late 16th century. But these technologies also have limitations. DNA degrades over time. Especially in humid environments, ancient burial sites are often unmarked and impossible to locate after centuries. Structures made of organic materials, wood, bark, thatch, decompose completely. The soil itself, constantly turned by ploughing and development, scrambles evidence. One of the more controversial modern discoveries involves a map. Researchers examining John White's map of the Virginia coast under special lighting discovered hidden marks. White had apparently drawn symbols and then covered them with patches. One of these hidden symbols appeared at a location inland from Roanoke Island. When archaeologists investigated that location, they found pottery fragments and other artifacts suggesting European presence. Is this evidence of a lost colony site, an outpost, a place where colonists hid supplies or planned to relocate? The discovery is intriguing, but like so much evidence related to the lost colony, it raises more questions than it answers. The challenge with modern discoveries is resisting the temptation to see what we want to see. We want to solve the mystery. We want to find the colonists, or at least find definitive evidence of what happened to them. This desire can lead to overinterpretation of ambiguous evidence. A ring could be a lost colony artifact, or it could have arrived at Hatteras Island by completely different means. Pottery fragments at an inland site could represent colonist activity, or they could be from native peoples who had European trade goods. Genetic markers suggesting European ancestry could date to the Roanoke period, or to later European contact. Responsible archaeology requires acknowledging uncertainty, resisting premature conclusions, and being honest about what the evidence can and cannot tell us. The modern discoveries related to the lost colony are valuable. They keep the investigation active. They provide pieces of information that, combined with historical and anthropological evidence, help us construct plausible theories. But they don't, at least not yet, provide the definitive answers we might wish for. Genetic evidence has entered the lost colony investigation in recent decades, offering a new approach to a centuries-old mystery. If the colonists survived by integrating with native communities, their descendants might still carry genetic markers that could prove that ancestry. This possibility has led to genetic studies of populations in eastern North Carolina, particularly the Lumbee tribe, which has long claimed lost colony descent. The Lumbee are a large Native American tribe centered in Robeson County, North Carolina. They have maintained for generations that they are descended, at least in part, from the lost colony. This claim is based on several pieces of evidence: family names that match colonist names, oral traditions about English ancestors, physical features that some members show, and the tribe's location in a region where colonists might plausibly have relocated. Surnames provide intriguing hints. The Lumbee population includes families named Dare, Cooper, Sampson, and other names that appear on the Roanoke colony roster. These could be coincidences. These are not unique names, but the concentration of the lost colony surnames among the Lumbee is noteworthy. Genetic studies have attempted to test the connection. Some studies have found that certain Lumbee individuals carry genetic markers indicating European ancestry. This isn't surprising in itself. There was significant contact between European settlers and native peoples throughout the colonial period. The question is whether this European ancestry can be dated specifically to the late 16th century, to the time of the lost colony. Dating genetic ancestry with precision is difficult. Geneticists can say, Quote 15, but the margin of error is often several generations. Distinguishing between ancestry from 1587 and ancestry from 1630, for example, may not be possible with current technology. There's also the question of which European populations contributed ancestry. The Lost Colony was English, but French, Spanish, and other European peoples were also active in the region in the 16th and 17th centuries. A genetic marker indicating European ancestry doesn't automatically mean Lost Colony ancestry specifically. Some genetic studies have looked for specific markers that might be more common in English populations than in other European groups. The results have been mixed and controversial. Some researchers claim to have found convincing evidence of English ancestry among the Lumbee dating to the appropriate period. Others have challenged these findings, arguing that the sample sizes were too small, the methodologies flawed, or the conclusions overreaching. The controversy reflects broader tensions about how genetic evidence should be used in historical and anthropological research. DNA can tell us about ancestry and migration patterns, but interpreting that data in specific historical contexts requires caution. Genes don't carry labels saying Roanoke Colony, 1587. We have to infer connections from patterns, and those inferences can be debated. There's also a political dimension to these genetic studies. The Lumbee tribe has been seeking federal recognition for decades. Proving Lost Colony descent might strengthen their case, or at least that's the perception. This creates incentives for finding evidence of the connection, and also creates skepticism about evidence that is found. Researchers must navigate these political waters carefully, maintaining scientific integrity while being sensitive to how their findings might be used. Beyond the Lumbee, there are other populations in eastern North Carolina that might carry Lost Colony ancestry. The Croatoan themselves, though they no longer exist as a distinct tribal group, would have been the most likely people to have intermarried with the colonists. Their descendants might be found among several different modern communities. Tracking these genetic lines is complicated by the fact that Native American populations were devastated by disease in the centuries after European contact. Smallpox, measles, and other European diseases killed native peoples in horrific numbers. Communities that might have included Lost Colony descendants could have been reduced to tiny remnants or wiped out entirely. Genetic lines could have been lost. There's also the possibility that Lost Colony descendants moved. Not all members of the Croatoan or other regional native groups necessarily stayed in North Carolina. Some might have migrated west, joining other tribes, spreading Lost Colony ancestry across a wider geographic area. Tracing these movements through genetic evidence would be extraordinarily difficult. The most honest assessment of the genetic evidence is that it's suggestive but not conclusive. It indicates that some people in eastern North Carolina carry European ancestry that could date to the Lost Colony period. Combined with the surname evidence, the oral traditions and the historical record, this genetic data supports the integration theory. But it doesn't prove it beyond all doubt. Like so much about the Lost Colony, we're left with probabilities rather than certainties, with strong suggestions rather than definitive proof. 400 years have passed since the Lost Colony disappeared, and still we search for answers. Why? Why does this particular historical mystery capture our attention when so many other events from the same period have been forgotten? What is it about 117 vanished colonists that continues to resonate? Part of the answer lies in the human element. These weren't just abstract historical figures. They were families. There were children, including an infant born just days before the governor left. There were husbands and wives, parents and children, people with hopes and fears and dreams. Their disappearance touches something fundamental in us. Our fear of abandonment, our anxiety about being forgotten. John White's story particularly resonates because it's a parent's nightmare made real. He left his daughter and newborn granddaughter, planning to return quickly with supplies. Instead, forces beyond his control kept him away for 3 years, and when he finally returned, they were gone. The guilt he must have felt, the wondering, the what-ifs, These are emotions we can understand across 4 centuries. We imagine Eleanor watching the horizon for White's ship month after month. We imagine Virginia growing from infant to toddler without her grandfather knowing. We imagine the moment when the colonists realised White wasn't coming back, at least not soon, and they would have to make decisions without him. These imaginings connect us to their experience in ways that make the mystery personal rather than merely academic. But there's another dimension to our fascination with the Lost Colony. It represents uncertainty and the limits of knowledge. We live in an era where information seems infinitely accessible. We can search the internet and find answers to almost any question. The idea that a historical question this important remains genuinely unsolved is both frustrating and, in a way, comforting. It's frustrating because we feel we should be able to know. We have archaeological techniques, genetic analysis, historical records. We have all these tools, and yet we still can't say with certainty what happened to these people. The mystery resists our best efforts at solution, but it's also comforting because it reminds us that not everything can be known, not everything can be resolved. There are genuine mysteries in the world. The past keeps some secrets. We can theorize, we can find evidence that suggests answers, but we can't achieve absolute certainty. And perhaps that's okay. Perhaps mystery has value in itself. The Lost Colony also speaks to questions about identity and belonging. If the colonists survived by integrating with native communities, they became something other than English colonists. Their children would have been hybrid, carrying multiple cultural heritages. This transformation from English to something new resonates in America, a nation built on immigration and cultural blending. We wonder about what was lost and what was gained in that transformation. Did Eleanor mourn the loss of English identity, or did she embrace her new life? Did Virginia ever long for a country she'd never seen, or was she content in the world she knew? These questions have no answers, but they mirror questions many Americans ask about their own immigrant ancestors. There's also something compelling about the idea of starting over. The colonists came to America hoping to build new lives. When that plan failed, they adapted, found another way to survive, created different lives than they'd imagined. That flexibility, that willingness to let go of one dream and embrace another, is admirable. It speaks to human resilience. We need to know what happened to the Lost Colony because their story is, in miniature, America's story. A group of people from one culture encountering people from another culture, trying to coexist, struggling to survive, ultimately blending together in ways that changed everyone involved. The mystery of what happened at Roanoke is connected to larger questions about what happens when cultures meet, what's preserved and what's lost, what emerges from the combination. And perhaps we need the mystery itself, not just its solution. A mystery creates space for imagination, for different interpretations, for ongoing investigation. If we definitively solved the Lost Colony mystery, we'd gain knowledge but lose the story's power to make us think, wonder, and question. The not knowing keeps us engaged with the colonists' humanity in a way that certain knowledge might not. So we continue to search, not because we expect to find definitive answers, but because the searching itself is meaningful. Each new archaeological discovery, each genetic study, each historical insight brings us closer to the colonists' experience. We may never know exactly what happened, but we can understand more deeply who they were, what choices they faced, and what their disappearance means for how we think about survival, adaptation, and the complex dance of cultures coming together. Disappearance meant something different in the 16th century than it does today. In our modern world, with global communication networks, satellite tracking, and digital records, truly disappearing is extraordinarily difficult. We expect to be able to locate people, to trace their movements, to find them if they're lost. But in the world of the Lost Colony, disappearing was much easier. There were no telegraphs, no telephones, no instant communication across distances. If you sailed away from England to America, you were essentially gone from English knowledge until you returned or sent word back. And sending word back required ships, which required favourable winds, which required months of travel. Communication gaps of years were normal. The colonists who sailed to Roanoke in 1587 were disappearing from English society by the very act of emigrating. Most of them would never have returned to England even if the colony had succeeded. They were making a one-way journey, choosing to become invisible to the England they left behind. In that sense, their later disappearance from historical record was just a more complete version of the disappearance they had chosen. For the people back in England who knew the colonists, the disappearance meant uncertainty and incomplete mourning. Families in England with relatives on Roanoke faced a cruel ambiguity. Were their loved ones alive or dead? Should they hope or grieve? This uncertainty could last for years, for decades, for the rest of their lives. We don't have records of these family members' experiences, but we can imagine them. A mother in England whose son sailed to Roanoke, waiting for word that never came. A wife whose husband was among the colonists, not knowing if she was a wife or a widow. The psychological burden of this not knowing would have been immense. In contrast, disappearance in the modern context usually involves active searching. When someone goes missing today, we launch search efforts. We call authorities, post on social media, organise search parties. We expect investigation, we expect answers, and we often get them, even if those answers are tragic. The Lost Colony had no such response. White tried to return, but his attempts were frustrated by circumstances beyond his control. No organised search effort was launched. The colonists simply vanished from English consciousness. Absorbed into the larger category of _quote_17_. This lack of search effort tells us something about the value placed on colonists' lives in that era. They were seen, to some extent, as expendable. The project of colonisation was important. Individual colonists were less so. If one colony failed, another would be attempted. The loss was regrettable, but not catastrophic from the perspective of English colonial policy. For the colonists themselves, disappearance meant something else entirely. From their perspective, they didn't disappear. They knew exactly where they were. They moved from Roanoke Island to Croatoan Island, or to other locations, and continued living their lives. The quote 18 was only from the English perspective, from the viewpoint of people who weren't there and didn't know where to look. This is an important point. The Lost Colony only appears lost because we're using English records as our frame of reference. If we had Croatoan records, if Native American communities had left written accounts of English people joining their populations, there would be no mystery. The colonists would have been documented, their fates known. The mystery is largely a product of whose perspective we privilege in telling the story. In modern times, the Lost Colony's disappearance has become symbolic. It represents the unknowable past, the limits of historical reconstruction, the way time erases lives and leaves only fragments. We project onto the Lost Colony our contemporary anxieties about being forgotten, about disappearing without a trace, about ceasing to matter. But perhaps the colonists' disappearance should be understood differently. Perhaps it wasn't a tragedy, but a transformation. They didn't cease to exist. They became something else. Their English identity dissolved into hybrid identity, and their descendants continued, carrying forward both Native American and European heritage, even if they didn't identify strongly with the European part. In this interpretation, the Lost Colony didn't vanish. It transformed, blended, became part of the larger story of cultural mixing in America. The people didn't disappear. They changed category. They stopped being quote 20 and became quote 21. That's not disappearance. That's adaptation. That's survival through transformation. Maybe the real question isn't quote 22, but rather quote 23. The colonists might have lived full, rich lives after leaving Roanoke. The fact that we can't trace those lives in English records says more about the limitations of our records than about the colonists' fate. Some mysteries get solved. New evidence emerges, old evidence is re-examined, and suddenly what was uncertain becomes clear. The Lost Colony hasn't followed that pattern. Despite centuries of investigation, despite archaeological work and genetic studies and historical research, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Why? And what does this persistent uncertainty mean? Part of the answer is simply the passage of time. 4 centuries is a long span for evidence to survive. Organic materials decay, structures collapse and rot. Bones turn to dust in acidic soil. Writing on paper or bark disintegrates. The longer we wait to investigate an event, the less evidence remains to find. We're fortunate to have as much evidence as we do. But there's also a deeper issue. The questions we're asking might not have the kind of answers we're looking for. We want to know exactly what happened to each colonist. We want names, dates, specific fates. Did Eleanor Dare live to old age? Did Virginia survive childhood? Where are they buried? These are reasonable questions, but they might be unanswerable. The historical record doesn't preserve that level of detail for most people from the 16th century. Even in England, even for people who never went to Virginia, we often don't have complete life records. Births, deaths, marriages. These were recorded inconsistently, if at all. For common people, the historical record is thin. For colonists who integrated with Native American communities, the record is essentially non-existent. Native American societies in the 16th century didn't have written languages. They preserved history through oral tradition, which is valuable but doesn't provide the specific, verifiable detail that written records can offer. When colonists became part of those communities, they entered a system that didn't create the kind of documentation we expect. So we're left with unanswered questions. And those unanswered questions have become part of the Lost Colony's legacy. Every generation finds something different in this mystery. Victorian Americans saw it as a story of white civilization confronting wilderness. Early 20th century Americans used it to explore anxieties about racial mixing. Mid-20th century Americans found in it themes of exploration and adventure. Modern Americans see questions about cultural identity, colonialism, and the complex relationship between European settlers and indigenous peoples. The unanswered questions allow for this interpretive flexibility. If we knew exactly what happened, the story would be fixed, its meaning settled. But because we don't know, we can continue to explore, to theorize, to project contemporary concerns onto historical events. This isn't necessarily bad. It means the lost colony remains relevant, continues to speak to each new generation, but we should be aware that we're doing this. We should recognize that when we tell stories about the lost colony, we're often saying more about ourselves, our own time, our own concerns, than we are about the actual colonists who lived and vanished 400 years ago. The mystery serves as a kind of mirror, reflecting our own preoccupations. The legacy of unanswered questions includes the work they've inspired. Archaeologists have excavated sites they might never have investigated if not for the lost colony connection. Geneticists have developed new techniques for analysing ancestry. Historians have examined the broader context of early colonisation efforts in ways that illuminate the entire period, not just this one failed colony. In that sense, the lost colony has been productive. The questions, even unanswered, have generated knowledge, have inspired research, have contributed to our understanding of the period. A solved mystery might have inspired less sustained attention than this persistent, uncertain one. There's also value in acknowledging what we don't know. Our culture tends to value certainty, to seek definitive answers, to be uncomfortable with ambiguity. The lost colony forces us to sit with ambiguity. It reminds us that not everything can be known, not every question can be answered, not every mystery can be solved. That's a valuable lesson. For some people, this is frustrating. They want answers, they want closure, they want to know what happened to those 117 people who vanished. And that desire is completely understandable. There's nothing wrong with wanting to solve historical mysteries. But for others, the unanswered questions are part of the story's power. The mystery invites participation. It allows us to theorize, to imagine, to engage actively with the past rather than passively receiving established facts. The Lost Colony belongs to everyone precisely because its story isn't completely told, because there's room for different interpretations, different emphases, different understandings. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Lost Colony's unanswered questions is the reminder that history is always partial, always incomplete. Every historical narrative leaves things out, glosses over uncertainties, makes assumptions to fill gaps in evidence. The Lost Colony just makes those limitations more obvious than most historical topics. The honesty of that incompleteness might be its most enduring contribution. Memory is how we connect past to present, how we make history meaningful rather than merely factual. But memory changes over time, shifts its shape, takes on new meanings as it passes through different generations, different cultures, different contexts. The memory of the Lost Colony across 4 centuries shows us how this transformation happens. In the decades immediately after the colony's disappearance, memory was personal for a few people. John White remembered. He carried the memory of his daughter and granddaughter, the memory of the colonists he'd left behind until his death. For him, the Lost Colony wasn't history. It was lived experience, painful and immediate, a wound that never healed. Others who had known the colonists, family members in England, friends, associates, carried similar personal memories. These memories died with them within a few decades of the colony's disappearance. By 1620 or 1630, no one alive had known the colonists personally. Memory had already become second-hand, historical rather than personal. For the next 2 centuries, the Lost Colony was largely forgotten. It wasn't part of American historical consciousness, because there wasn't really an American historical consciousness yet. The colonies that succeeded, Jamestown, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, overshadowed Roanoke in historical memory. Roanoke was a footnote, a failed first attempt, interesting mainly for its failure. But in the 19th century, as America was developing its national identity and searching for origin stories, the Lost Colony was rediscovered. Writers and historians found in Roanoke a story that spoke to emerging American themes: pioneering spirit, courage in the face of hardship, tragic sacrifice, the costs of building a nation. Virginia Dare became particularly important in this 19th century reinvention. She was transformed from a historical infant about whom we know almost nothing into a symbolic figure. She appeared in poems, novels, and plays as the embodiment of American innocence and pioneering virtue. Some of these portrayals were deeply racist, imagining Virginia as a beautiful white woman raised by Indians, using her to explore anxieties about racial purity and cultural boundaries. This 19th century memory of the Lost Colony tells us more about 19th century America than about the actual 16th century colony. The Lost Colony became a screen onto which Americans projected their own concerns about westward expansion, about encounters with native peoples, about the costs and meanings of building a continental nation. In the 20th century, the memory of the Lost Colony took yet another form. Tourism discovered Roanoke. The outdoor drama The Lost Colony, first performed in 1937, turned the story into entertainment. A summer theatre production that drew visitors to North Carolina's Outer Banks. This commercialization of memory transformed the colony from historical event into cultural product. The tourism industry built around the Lost Colony created a particular kind of memory. It emphasized mystery and romance. It downplayed the colonial violence that characterized English-native relations. It presented a sanitized version of the story that was more comfortable for 20th century audiences than a more historically accurate account would have been. Meanwhile, in academic circles, memory of the Lost Colony was being shaped by changing historical methodologies. Early 20th century historians tended to focus on great men and political events. Later historians brought attention to social history, to the experiences of ordinary people, to questions about cultural contact and exchange. Each approach created a different kind of memory, emphasize different aspects of the story. In our own time, memory of the lost colony is being shaped by contemporary concerns about colonialism, about indigenous peoples' perspectives, about whose stories get told and how. There's increasing interest in understanding the lost colony not just as an English story, but as a story involving Native American peoples who had their own agency, their own perspectives, their own reasons for the choices they made. This contemporary memory tries to center Native American experiences in ways earlier versions of the story didn't. It asks questions like, what did Manteo think about all this? How did the Croatoan people experience having English colonists join their community? What were the power dynamics? Who was using whom, and for what purposes? These are valuable questions, but we should recognize that we're still constructing memory, still creating narratives that serve present purposes. We can try to be more inclusive, more aware of multiple perspectives, more critical of colonial assumptions, but we're still making choices about what to emphasize, what to remember, how to tell the story. Memory across 4 centuries has transformed the lost colony from historical event to cultural symbol, from personal tragedy to national myth, from simple mystery to complex meditation on cultural contact and colonial history. Each generation remembers differently because each generation needs something different from the past. The colonists who lived and vanished remain the same, but our memory of them continues to evolve. If you visit Roanoke Island today, you'll find a small piece of North Carolina connected to the mainland by bridges, developed with homes and businesses, marked with signs pointing tourists to historical sites. The fort where the colonists lived has been partially reconstructed based on archaeological evidence. There's a visitor centre with exhibits. There's the theatre where Quote 26 performs each summer. The island has been thoroughly incorporated into modern American life, but underneath that modern landscape, the island itself remains. The same soil the colonists walked on, the same waters lapping at the shores, the same sun rising over the sound each morning. The physical geography hasn't changed much in 4 centuries. If Eleanor Dare could return, she would recognize the island's basic shape, its relationship to the water, the feel of the wind, and perhaps, in some metaphorical sense, the island remembers. Not literally, of course. Islands don't have consciousness or memory. But the land holds evidence, artifacts, traces of the people who lived there. Archaeological sites are a kind of memory, material traces that persist when human memory fails. The island remembers through the artifacts still waiting to be found. Somewhere in the soil might be objects the colonists touched, used, valued, personal items that could tell us something about individual lives. We haven't found everything yet. Each new excavation brings the possibility of discovery, of recovery, of adding to what the island can tell us. The island remembers through its position, its geography. The same challenges the colonists faced. The difficult passage through the Outer Banks, the shallow sound, the distance from ideal farmland, remain part of the island's character. Modern technology has overcome some of these limitations, but the fundamental geography endures. Standing on Roanoke Island today, you can understand why the colonists found it both appealing and frustrating. The waters around the island remember too, in their way. The same fish spawn in these waters. The same currents flow. The same storms sweep through each year. The colonists who learned to fish these waters, who navigated these channels, who weathered these storms, were encountering the same natural rhythms that continue today. The Native American communities whose ancestors encountered the English colonists remember through oral traditions, through family stories passed down through generations. These memories may have changed over time, may have blended with other stories, but they persist. The Lumbee and other tribes in the region maintain their connection to this history, their claims to lost colony ancestry. That's memory too, preserved not in documents or artifacts, but in living communities. The descendants, if they exist, and the evidence suggests they do, carry memory in their very genes. DNA holds information across generations. Even if someone doesn't know they have lost colony ancestry, that ancestry might still be traceable in their genetic code. This is perhaps the most intimate form of memory, the body itself carrying forward traces of the past. There's a poetic quality to imagining the island remembering. 400 years is a long time for humans, but not so long for land, for soil, for the slow processes of geological time. The island has been here for thousands of years. The colonists' brief presence, even if they lived there for several years, was just a moment in the island's longer existence. Yet that moment mattered. Those people lived, struggled, made choices, felt hope and fear, loved and grieved and dreamed. Their brief time on the island was their entire world. The fact that 4 centuries have passed doesn't diminish the reality of their experience, the weight of their lives. When you stand on Roanoke Island today, you're standing where they stood. You're breathing air above soil they walked on. You're looking at water they fished in, land they tried to farm, sky they watched for ships that didn't come. This physical continuity creates a connection across time that's real, even if it's not complete, even if we can't know exactly what they thought or felt. The island remembers imperfectly, in fragments, in traces. But it remembers, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps we don't need complete memory, perfect knowledge of everything that happened. Perhaps the fragments are sufficient to honour the colonists' experience, to acknowledge their existence, to keep their story alive. As the sun sets over Roanoke Island each evening, casting long shadows across the water, you can imagine the colonists watching the same sunset, wondering about their future, hoping for White's return, making plans, living their lives as fully as they could in uncertain circumstances. The island was witness to all of it, and in its silent material way, the island remembers, and by remembering, keeps the colonists from being completely lost. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey into the mystery of the Lost Colony. We've spent over 2 hours together exploring this story, examining the evidence, considering the theories, contemplating what it all might mean. I'm grateful you chose to spend this time here, letting this old mystery unfold slowly, carefully, without rushing toward conclusions that might not exist. We've travelled from England in the 1580s, across the Atlantic with hopeful colonists, to Roanoke Island where they tried to build new lives. We've followed John White through his years of frustration and failure, his desperate attempts to return to the daughter and granddaughter he left behind. We've examined the word carved in wood, Croatoan, and tried to understand its meaning. We've explored theories about integration, survival, transformation. We've considered what the archaeological evidence suggests, what genetic studies might tell us, what oral traditions have preserved. The answer, as honestly as I can give it, is that we know some things, but not everything. We know the colonists existed, that they arrived at Roanoke, that White left them and couldn't return for 3 years, that when he finally did return they were gone, having carved Croatoan to indicate their destination. We know they probably went to Croatoan Island, to Manteo's people. We know they probably survived for some time by integrating with native communities. We know their descendants, if they exist, might be among us still, carrying forward both European and Native American heritage. What we don't know is the individual stories, the personal experiences, the specific fates. We don't know if Eleanor lived to be old, if Virginia grew to adulthood, if the colonists found peace in their new lives or only hardship. We don't know, and we may never know, and perhaps that's a truth we need to accept. If you found this slow drift through history meaningful, if it helped you think about the past in new ways or simply gave you a peaceful way to end your day, a like and subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps others find these calm explorations. And to those who've been here before, who've joined me for other journeys through history's mysteries, thank you for coming back. Your presence makes this work worthwhile. Wherever you are in the world right now, in a quiet bedroom, in a corner where you've finally found some peace, on a journey of your own, I hope your breathing has slowed. I hope your thoughts have quieted. I hope your body feels heavy and warm and ready for rest. Look up at the stars tonight if you can. Imagine, if you will, Eleanor and Virginia looking at the same stars 400 years ago from Croatoan Island, the constellations wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns, unchanging across centuries, connecting their moment to ours. All those colonists who vanished from history but not from existence. All those lives fully lived and then lost to memory. All those stories that ended in silence. They were real. They mattered. Their hopes and fears and dreams were as vivid and important to them as ours are to us. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Lost Colony is simply this: memory is fragile, certainty is rare, and mystery is not the opposite of meaning. We can honour the colonists' experience without knowing all the details. We can acknowledge their reality without being able to reconstruct their entire story. The fact that they vanished from historical record doesn't mean they failed, or that their lives lacked purpose. It means only that the records are incomplete, as all records are, as all memories eventually become. Sleep well tonight. Dream, if you will, of islands and colonies, of integration and survival, of mysteries that remind us how much of the past remains beyond our knowing. Dream of people who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances and did their best to survive. Dream of cultural blending, of transformation, of the ways people adapt when adaptation is the only path forward. Good night. Rest easy in the knowledge that not everything needs to be known, not every mystery needs to be solved, and that there's a kind of peace in accepting the limits of what we can recover from the past. The island remembers, the stars remember, and somewhere, in genes and soil and stories half forgotten, the lost colony endures,